A woman screamed. A flight attendant froze. And all eyes turned to the black girl in seat 3B. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. But somehow, she was the problem. The air shifted the moment she boarded. Too young, too quiet, too out of place for first class. No one said it directly, but every stare did. Her hoodie was too plain. Her skin too dark. Her presence too loud, without a sound. They questioned her seat. They questioned her right to be there. They laughed when she stayed silent. They panicked when she didn't. What they didn't know was that every second, every word, every look was being watched. And when the truth arrived, it didn't knock. It stood up. If you're ready for the twist that silenced an entire plane, like this video, subscribe for what comes next, and comment below. What do you see when you look at seat 3B? And where are you watching from? Let's talk. When Neria Quinn stepped into the first-class cabin of Flight 378 from Newark to San Francisco, every detail about her had already been measured, dissected, and judged. She was 14, black, soft-spoken, and wore a simple NASA sweatshirt over pressed jeans with spotless sneakers. Her dark curls were pulled back in a neat low bun, and in one hand, she held a paperback copy of Hidden Figures, its corners worn and creased. She moved with quiet confidence, not out of arrogance, but because her father taught her to never look like she was in the wrong room. Yet, that was exactly what everyone else decided she was. The moment she passed the curtain separating coach from the elite, the atmosphere shifted, not with volume, but with silence. Conversations faded and glances sharpened. Her boarding pass read to a window seat, but the space felt colder than the air-conditioned cabin around her. A woman in 3B, Lorelei Stanford, diamond watch, pearl earrings, and a smug expression carved into her face, leaned toward the man beside her and murmured, "Mentorship program, maybe? They're letting them on board earlier now." The man didn't answer. He just gave a smirk and turned a page in his Financial Times. Neria said nothing. She found her seat, sat down, and placed her bag carefully under the seat in front of her. Her book remained open, but her focus was fractured. Moments later, a flight attendant, mid-30s, pin-straight blonde hair, badge-reading Carly, walked briskly down the aisle, pausing beside Neria with a forced smile. "Hi, sweetie," she said, tilting her head. "Are you waiting for a parent or guardian?" Neria looked up. Her voice, calm and rehearsed, replied, "No, I'm in 2A. I have my boarding pass." Carly blinked, flustered but trying to recover. "Oh, well, of course you are." She leaned in and added softly, "Just try not to crowd the aisle, okay?" Neria didn't respond. She wasn't crowding anything. Across the aisle, Lorelei adjusted her scarf and stared openly, as if Neria were a museum piece that didn't belong in the exhibit. "It used to mean something to fly first class," she whispered, not so quietly, to the man next to her. Neria's throat tightened, but she pressed her eyes to the page, reading the same sentence again and again. A few rows ahead, a passenger began taking selfies. Neria looked up for a second, just out of curiosity. The woman zoomed in, then frowned. "Not the background I wanted," she muttered, turning her phone away. Neria returned to her book. 3 minutes later, a man in the row behind Neria leaned forward and tapped her shoulder. He had a heavy Rolex on his wrist, and the smile of someone who never got challenged. "Hey kid," he said, "mind ducking your head a bit during takeoff? I paid for this view." Neria blinked. "Sure," she said quietly, her voice barely above the engine hum. She hunched a little lower in her seat, ashamed of her silhouette against the window. 10 minutes before departure, Lorelei summoned a flight attendant with a press of a button and a raised eyebrow. When Carly returned, Lorelei gestured subtly with her chin. "I just wanted to check something," she said, her voice honeyed but sharp. "I thought this section was reserved for elite-level members. I'm not trying to make trouble." But her eyes flicked to Neria and back. Carly glanced at Neria's name on her list and nodded faintly. "She's listed here, ma'am." Lorelei gave a fake smile. "That's unfortunate." Behind them, a middle-aged woman muttered under her breath, "She probably won an Instagram contest." The man next to her chuckled. When the pre-flight drinks were served, Neria didn't get asked what she'd like. Carly offered champagne and sparkling water to every seat in a row, then skipped over her, as if she wasn't there. Neria opened her mouth, then closed it again. She didn't want to make a fuss. A boy across the aisle whispered to his mother, "Why is she up here?" The mother shushed him and gave Neria a brief, apologetic smile, the kind that offered no comfort. Just before takeoff, another flight attendant came by, a man this time, with an overly cheerful voice. He looked at Neria and asked, "Sweetheart, you sure you're in the right seat? Want me to check that for you?" Neria handed over her pass, her fingers trembling only slightly. "It's 2A," she said. He checked, then nodded and gave a tight-lipped smile. "Well, would you look at that?" Once they were in the air, a man one row back spoke to the attendant in a deliberately loud voice. "It's sad how standards have changed," he said. "Used to be you could expect a certain experience in first class. Now it's just unpredictable." Carly nodded along, not disagreeing. Neria hadn't said a word since boarding. Her water cup came half full. Her seatback screen didn't work. Her headphones were misplaced, and they told her to wait until we finished cabin service to see if there were extras. Her seatmate, a woman in her 40s with perfect posture, shifted uncomfortably every time Neria adjusted her legs. Not a single smile was real. Not a single voice was warm. Everything she touched felt secondhand. And when Neria finally dozed off for 10 minutes with her book still in her lap, someone gently nudged her shoulder, not kindly, but like one might wake a stranger blocking the aisle. "Sorry," said the attendant, "but you'll need to stow that book if you're going to sleep. It's a safety issue." It wasn't. No one else was told anything. She blinked the sleep from her eyes, whispered, "Okay," and slid the book into the pocket in front of her. The air around Neria Quinn hadn't softened since takeoff. It had only grown denser, as if every glance and whisper formed a layer of invisible pressure. The seat still felt too big and too small at once. She hadn't moved except to shift her legs, careful not to brush the armrest that Lorelei Stanford had claimed entirely for herself. Lorelei, with her powdery perfume and cashmere shawl, adjusted her reading glasses and pulled a thick hardcover book from her tote. The gold-stamped title glinted as she placed it dramatically on the armrest that separated them. Why Civilizations Fail. Neria didn't react, but the book sat there like a threat. Lorelei opened it without a word, flipped quickly past the foreword, the introduction, and settled deliberately on a chapter labeled Cultural Collapse Through Mass Migration. Her eyes scanned the page, and she let out a thoughtful hum, loud enough for Neria to hear. Then she tilted the book ever so slightly, angling it in Neria's direction, just enough so the headline glared back at her like a headline from a paper that never wanted her here in the first place. The Death of Identity, How Immigration Dilutes the Founding Values of Empires. Lorelei didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Every turn of the page was an accusation. Every underline in that chapter, done in crisp, perfect blue pen, was like a barb aimed just beneath Neria's skin. The girl glanced at the window, but the words were still there, blurring her peripheral vision. She tried to focus on the clouds, tried to pretend she hadn't read the subheading, when inclusion becomes invasion. Still, she didn't speak. She couldn't. Her voice didn't feel like it belonged here either. A few rows behind, a man in a gray business suit stood and walked toward the aisle. As he passed, he glanced at Neria, then did a double take. He paused, leaned slightly toward her row, and checked his watch. Something about his stance said he was looking for an excuse to interrupt. Neria turned and asked softly, "Excuse me, sir, do you have a time?" Her tone was polite, gentle, careful. He blinked, leaned closer, and cupped his hand behind his ear. "Sorry." Neria repeated her question, slightly louder. "The time." The man straightened, gave a chuckle, and said, "Come on, sweetheart, try to pronounce your words a little clearer. English is all about diction." He tapped his own ear like the fault lay in her accent. Neria froze. Her lips parted, but no sound came. He checked his Rolex theatrically, called out, 3:47, give or take, then walked on, leaving a trail of amused smiles from the passengers nearby. One woman stifled a laugh behind a travel magazine. Someone else muttered, "Kids these days can't even ask a question properly." Neria clenched the pages of her book. She didn't look up. She didn't correct them. Her heartbeat stayed steady, too steady. It had nowhere to run. Beside her, Lorelei sighed and flipped another page. "I always admired how the Romans handled things," she said aloud, still not looking at Neria. Order, discipline, a clear sense of who belonged where. The comment wasn't aimed at anyone specific, but it struck its mark. Neria stared at the little safety card tucked into the seat pocket. She'd read it 3 times already. Now she counted the creases. 3 on the top right corner. 1 folded edge. A coffee stain near the diagram of emergency exits. Lorelei kept talking, her voice a slow drizzle of venom wrapped in civility. Empires fall when lines are blurred. That's all this chapter is saying. She tapped the page with her manicured finger, the sound sharp as a clock ticking down to something Neria couldn't yet name. She wanted to shift away, but the seat was full. The air was full. She didn't even have the freedom to move without it being misread. The man from earlier walked past again. He glanced over and grinned like they shared a joke. "All good now?" he asked. Neria nodded once, just to end it. He kept walking, laughing to himself. Somewhere 2 rows up, a champagne cork popped and someone toasted a business deal. Neria wasn't sure what language they were speaking, but it sounded rich, confident, the kind of tone people don't question. Her own voice, small and quiet, still echoed in her ears, distorted by the man's mockery. "Try to pronounce your words a little clearer." She could hear it again and again, the way his eyes had crinkled, the way he'd acted like he was doing her a favor. She blinked hard, forcing herself not to cry. Not here. Not now. Not ever in front of them. She took a slow breath and turned her eyes back to Lorelei's book. It was still open. Now the headline read, "Cultural Entitlement Masquerading as Progress." Underneath, Lorelei had underlined a sentence in bold blue pen. "A society that welcomes everyone inevitably becomes a society that stands for nothing." Neria didn't know if she wanted to scream or disappear, but she knew she couldn't do either. Not in this seat. Not with these eyes on her. Not in this world where she had no one sitting next to her, no adult to lean on, no hand to squeeze beneath the table. And still, she said nothing. Because she wasn't allowed to speak. Because if she did, it would be attitude. If she raised her voice, it would be aggressive. If she defended herself, it would be disruptive. She had learned long ago that silence was the only armor she could wear in rooms like this. Rooms built to remind her she didn't belong. So Neria stayed still. Not out of weakness. Out of necessity. The book still sat open between them. A border Neria hadn't asked for, but was forced to read. Its chapters like whispered insults pressed into her periphery. She kept her head down now, watching the slow crawl of seconds on her watch, trying to shrink herself into the seat. But invisibility here was a privilege she wasn't allowed to have. Just when she thought the cabin had settled, that maybe they'd moved on, that maybe the eyes were drifting elsewhere, the next blow landed, this time not from a look, but from an envelope. Carly, the same attendant who had ignored her twice before, returned to the row, smiling like nothing had happened. She held a small white packet in one hand, the same size and shape as the menus she'd been passing out across the cabin. Neria instinctively reached for it, grateful. Finally, maybe something normal. But when she opened the flap and pulled out the single sheet inside, her stomach tightened. It wasn't a menu. It was a flyer. Bold letters at the top read, "Careers at Altura Air Cabin Crew Opportunities." Neria blinked once. The paper had been cleanly folded, not crumpled or mistaken for something else. There were no other menus in Carly's hand. This had been intentional. She didn't even look at Neria when she handed it off, just dropped it like a tip on a table, then moved on without pause. Lorelei gave a quiet chuckle, not even trying to hide it. Neria folded the flyer carefully, slipped it into the seat pocket, and said nothing. Not because she didn't want to say something, but because her throat wouldn't cooperate. Every second that passed was a lesson. Speak, and they'd say she was dramatic. Push back, and she'd be removed. And so silence became the only response she was permitted. The soft chime of the service bell echoed down the aisle. Lorelei pressed the button and waited like royalty. When Carly returned, Lorelei didn't whisper. She leaned in just enough for the words to float, clear and sharp. "Can you verify this row again?" she asked, her eyes darting toward Neria. I don't want to assume, but she doesn't exactly match the passenger profile. Might be a scholarship fluke or some educational outreach. She paused for dramatic effect. I mean, look at her, trying so hard to blend in, it's almost sweet. Carly gave a faint, uncomfortable smile, glanced at Neria as if she were luggage needing to be retagged, then nodded. I'll check the manifest again, she said, and disappeared behind the curtain. Neria didn't turn her head. She didn't meet Lorelai's eyes. She just kept breathing slowly, as if each inhale required approval. Her hands were clenched under the blanket now, tucked between her thighs to hide the tension in her knuckles. The flyer was still there in the seat pocket, mocking her quietly. The menu had never arrived. She hadn't eaten. No one offered water again. But somehow the pressure in her chest wasn't from hunger. It was from the relentless performance. She was performing stillness, performing harmlessness, performing silence. And no matter how well she played the part, they kept rewriting the script. Behind her, she could hear whispers from other passengers, too low to fully understand, but unmistakably about her. The word diversity floated up once. Then PR stunt. Someone else said, quota. She didn't know who. She didn't need to. Their words weren't new. Only the location changed. A tall man in a suit passed by on his way to the restroom. He paused at their row and leaned slightly toward Lorelai. Everything okay here, he asked, clearly not addressing Neria. Lorelai smiled sweetly and replied, all fine. We're just adjusting. The man smiled back like it was an inside joke. Neria stared straight ahead. Then came the clipboard. Another attendant, a man this time, tall, polite, but cold, walked past and returned with a tablet in his hands. He stopped at their row, crouched slightly, and asked, "May I confirm your name, miss?" Neria blinked. "Why?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Just a routine check," he replied, tapping on the screen. "There's been some uncertainty about one of the seat assignments." She handed over her boarding pass without looking at Lorelai. He scanned it, glanced back at the manifest, then nodded. "Thank you." No apology, no explanation, just confirmation that she had, once again, passed a test no one else was being asked to take. The man walked off without further comment. Lorelai smiled, as if vindicated. "See," she said to no one. "Sometimes instincts are right." She sipped her wine. Neria sat frozen, the space around her shrinking again, collapsing one assumption at a time. The clouds outside the window moved slower now, or maybe time was just dragging. Her eyes burned, not from tears, she wouldn't give them that yet, but from the effort of holding them back. Even blinking felt like weakness. The book in her lap remained unread. Her throat ached from tension. Her stomach churned from nothing. And still, she didn't move. At some point, the lights dimmed. The ambient glow of first-class comfort settled around her like a lie too expensive to question. Neria closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to retreat inward. Her thoughts, normally filled with galaxies and physics problems and solar flares, had been reduced to equations of survival. How still could she sit? How quiet could she breathe? How much longer could she pretend this was just turbulence? She heard Carly laugh with another passenger 2 rows up. Then a clink of glasses. Then Lorelai's voice again, low but clear. They really should have kept this section exclusive. It's not about race, it's about standards. That's all. Neria opened her eyes and stared at the back of the seat in front of her. She mouthed the word standards once, just to taste the hypocrisy. The flyer was still there, stuffed deep in the seat pocket like a stain no one could clean. Neria hadn't touched it again. She didn't need to. It was etched into her memory. Those bold letters offering career growth for cabin crew, given to her not as an opportunity, but as a reminder. You are meant to serve here, not sit here. And now, even silence betrayed her. Her quietness had been mistaken for weakness. Her compliance twisted into confirmation that she didn't belong, and the more invisible she tried to become, the more visible she felt. Like a spotlight had been aimed at her from the moment she buckled in. She hadn't spoken for almost an hour now. No one had asked her to. No one had looked her way since the clipboard incident, unless it was to verify she hadn't done something wrong. The hum of idle conversation returned to the cabin. Somewhere 2 rows up, a group of adults, 3 men and a woman in matching corporate lanyards, had finished their second round of wine and were looking for new entertainment. One of them, a man with cropped gray hair and a booming voice, announced, "All right, let's play something. Nothing intense, just a pastime. How about a round of if the plane turned around right now? Who's getting searched first?" The others laughed. It was supposed to be funny. Another man chimed in, "Oh yeah, that game." The woman leaned back in her seat and called out, "Can we vote?" The man in the aisle grinned and said, "Let's make it simple, row by row. I call 3B. The laughter that followed wasn't explosive, but sharp, like a knife being sharpened rather than swung. Neria didn't look back. She knew what seat she was in. Everyone did now. Lorelei chuckled without shame. "You should have seen the clipboard moment," she said to no one in particular. "I almost thought they were going to find something." The people in the group kept laughing, and someone muttered, "Wouldn't surprise me if she had a fake passport too." Neria felt her ears burn, her hands tightening around the book in her lap that she hadn't turned a page of in over 20 minutes. The pages had blurred together, just text floating in front of her like static. The words couldn't protect her here. A bell rang again. The carts rolled down the aisle, this time offering warm cookies, prepackaged but fresh. Carly came first to 3, smiled brightly, and offered him 2. Then to 3C. Then to Lorelei. Everyone got theirs with a cheerful question. Macadamia or chocolate chip? When she reached Neria's seat, she paused, the tongs in her hand hovering just above the tray. She tilted her head and asked, casually but audibly, "Do you have any dietary restrictions? Allergies? Maybe something from where you're from?" Neria blinked. "I'm from Baltimore," she said quietly. Carly gave a quick smile that didn't reach her eyes. Right. Just making sure. Some of the newer meals can be rich." She handed Neria a single cookie wrapped in extra napkins, as if worried her hands might contaminate it. Then she turned and rolled the cart forward without another word. Neria sat still, holding the cookie like it was evidence. Her throat tightened again, but she swallowed it down. The idea of eating it made her stomach curl. She placed it carefully in the tray's corner and returned her hands to her lap. Lorelei, beside her, took a bite of her own cookie and smirked. "You know," she said softly, "when I was your age, I dreamed of flying too. But I dreamed of earning it." Neria didn't respond. She didn't look up. She knew what Lorelei wanted. A reaction, a twitch, anything to prove the words had landed. But Neria had learned a harder skill, the art of disappearing while remaining physically present. She stayed so still, she almost believed she'd gone invisible. But the others hadn't forgotten her. The corporate group launched into another game. This one, a guessing game. "Guess the origin story," someone said. "You look at a person and guess where they're from, what their life was like, what they want." Someone immediately turned their head toward Neria's row. "Okay, that one," the gray-haired man said. "3rd row window seat. What do we think?" The woman in the group replied, "MMM. Public school, probably inner city. Father absent or correctional history. Raised by a hard-working grandmother," another guessed. Then plucked out by some program that puts kids like her in elite spaces to diversify. The man laughed. God bless charity. They didn't whisper. They didn't even lower their voices. Because they knew the silence was her only response. Because they wanted her to hear it. The power wasn't just in what they said, it was in daring her to react. Lorelei flipped her book again, this time to a chapter titled Cultural Evolution or Cultural Erosion. She underlined something new. Neria could feel the movement even without looking. She didn't need to read it. She already knew the message. By now, the flight had reached cruising altitude. The window showed nothing but clouds, endless and white, like a sky that refused to offer shelter. Neria turned her face toward it, hoping the cold from the glass might numb the heat crawling up her neck. Her legs were cramping. Her arms had gone stiff. But still, she didn't move. She couldn't. The only safe position was stillness. A different flight attendant passed by, offering tea. She skipped Neria entirely. No words. Just walked past. Neria didn't ask. She knew the pattern. In the row behind her, someone whispered, "She hasn't even looked up in an hour." Weird, right? Another voice replied, probably afraid to. That's what guilt does. And the conversation shifted to sports. Like nothing had happened. Because to them, nothing had. The laughter from the corporate group had faded into quiet smugness, and the cabin settled into a strange rhythm of artificial peace. A peace Neria knew too well was not for her. The cookie still sat uneaten on her tray table, a stale symbol of the comfort she was never meant to enjoy. She had turned fully toward the window now, forehead nearly pressed to the glass, eyes wide open but unfocused. Her body hadn't moved in nearly 20 minutes. Stillness was no longer a strategy. It was survival. Every sound in the cabin passed through her ears like static. A cork being pulled, the rustle of newspapers, ice cubes swirling in a glass of bourbon. She tuned it all out until a hand, unexpected, intrusive, tapped her shoulder. She flinched. A man from the row behind leaned forward, his arm halfway across the seat, his phone raised in his other hand. "Hey," he said casually, as if they knew each other. "I'm live streaming this flight. Just giving folks a look at the first-class experience, you know? Can you scoot a bit? You're kind of off-theme." Neria blinked, unsure if she heard him right. He nodded toward his phone. "It's nothing personal. I'm going for a luxury vibe. You're not what my followers expect." His smile was polite, friendly even, but his words cracked like dry branches beneath her ribs. Neria said nothing. She turned her face away again. The man shrugged, mumbled whatever, and adjusted the angle of his camera. She could still hear him as he narrated. "We're cruising now, folks. First class is all about tranquility, elegance, curated space." Then he paused and added lower but still audible, "Well, almost." A few people watching turned their heads briefly, as if to catch the disruption. No one said anything. Neria remained still, her hands folded in her lap, nails digging into her palms. Her breathing was shallow now. She no longer dared to exhale too loudly. She feared even her breath might offend someone's expectations. Just as she thought it couldn't get worse, a couple across the aisle, well-dressed mid-60s, wearing matching travel scarves, glanced toward her. The woman tugged at her husband's sleeve, whispered something, and both pulled their masks down. Not to speak, but to make a show. The husband crinkled his nose exaggeratedly and said aloud, "Cabin air doesn't feel as fresh lately, does it?" The wife nodded, then raised her hand to wave over a flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sugar-coated. "Do you have any eucalyptus-scented wipes? We're just sensitive to changes in air quality." Her eyes landed on Neria as she spoke. Not a glance of concern, not even anger, just cold, clinical calculation. Neria didn't move. She didn't react. Her body was there, but her mind had begun peeling away like old wallpaper. She didn't know what she looked like anymore. She imagined herself from above, small, silent, dark against the sterile backdrop of white leather, soft gold light, and curated elegance. She was the scratch on a crystal glass, the speck on a porcelain plate, the note out of key in a well-rehearsed song. Lorelei sighed and adjusted her scarf, again making sure it didn't touch Neria's armrest. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through an app filled with photos of her garden, her grandchildren, her travels. After a few seconds, she leaned slightly toward Neria and said, without turning her head, "Just so you know, being tolerated isn't the same as being welcomed. A lot of people get those confused." Neria didn't reply. She couldn't. Her throat had gone dry hours ago. Her body had stiffened to the point she could no longer feel her toes. Even blinking took effort. The lights in the cabin dimmed slightly as the sun began its descent over the wing. Golden light poured in through the window, painting the aisle in soft tones, but for Neria, it only highlighted how isolated she had become. The seat next to her was occupied, but the space around her was empty in every way that mattered. No conversation, no comfort, no connection. The man behind her coughed. Not violently, just enough to draw attention. Then he coughed again. The woman next to him reached into her bag, pulled out hand sanitizer, and offered it to him. She glanced at Neria and shook her head, saying, We should have brought wipes for the armrests too. Another nod. Another exchange that excluded her presence entirely while being entirely about her. The same flight attendant who had handed her the job flyer earlier now walked by, offering small moist towels scented with lavender. Neria extended her hand, but the attendant pretended not to see. The tray continued down the aisle. Neria let her arm fall back to her side slowly. The scent reached her anyway, soft and mocking, like a spa commercial she hadn't paid for. In front of her, the corporate group resumed talking, this time about legacy admissions and merit-based promotions. One of them said, "I mean, it's fine to give opportunities, but not at the expense of quality." Another replied, "You can't bend standards just to look diverse." The third, a woman, added, "Exactly. Excellence matters. Otherwise, you water down the whole experience." They weren't talking to her, but they were absolutely talking about her. Her body no longer reacted to the constant micro-assaults that passed her way. She had become a statue with a pulse, motionless, wordless, and invisible in every way that mattered, yet still surrounded by people who wouldn't stop pressing in. The comment about cabin air still lingered in her ears, sour and unshakable, and the unwanted live stream had only confirmed what she'd known all along. Her presence in this space was tolerated only as long as she didn't disrupt the aesthetic. She hadn't said a word in hours. She hadn't touched the cookie. The book on her lap remained open to the same page she'd been staring at since takeoff, though none of the words had reached her. It was at that exact point, when she'd given up trying to make herself smaller, that the next blow came. A girl, maybe 17 or 18, walked up the aisle in leggings and a cropped hoodie that said Yale Tour 2022. She stopped beside Neria's seat, paused as if uncertain, then smiled and leaned in slightly. "Hey," she said brightly, "just curious, your hair, is it like real?" Her voice was polite, laced with fascination instead of cruelty, but it landed just the same. Neria blinked slowly. She didn't respond, but the girl continued, oblivious. "I mean, it's so thick and pretty. I just wondered if it's, yours or one of those wigs they do for events. I saw a girl like that on a field trip once. They dressed her up like a future senator or something." The girl giggled, as if they were sharing a harmless joke, then added, "Sorry, I'm just kind of obsessed with textures. Yours is super unique." Neria looked at her, eyes flat and empty. "It's mine," she said, her voice low, dull. The girl gave a little thumbs up and skipped off, satisfied with the answer, unaware or uncaring that her words had pierced deeper than she would ever understand. Lorelei, who had been scrolling through her phone, perked up. "That was kind of sweet," she said aloud. "Kids these days, so curious." Then, as if remembering something important, she reached into the front pocket of her designer tote and pulled out a rolled-up fashion magazine. She opened it to a bookmark page and held it up to Neria without warning. The model on the page was tall, pale, with sleek blonde hair in a tight ponytail and high cheekbones painted with minimalist perfection. The photo was black and white, elegant and crisp. Lorelei tapped the image twice with her manicured finger and said, "This is what Grace looks like. Clean lines, soft eyes, a kind of timeless femininity. If you ever wanted to, you could probably get close." She flipped the page again. Or this one, very polished, very poised. No need for all that texture and wildness. She let the word hang in the air. Wildness. Neria didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stared at the space between the two seats in front of her, where the polished wood veneer gleamed under the cabin light. Lorelei placed the magazine on the armrest between them and said, "No pressure, of course. Some people like to express themselves differently, but fitting in has its benefits. Just something to think about." She returned to her wine as if she had just shared a beauty tip instead of gutting a child with a backhanded compliment. Neria didn't reach for the magazine. She didn't move it. She let it sit there like another weight pressing down on her identity. She wasn't wearing her hair to prove anything. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't political. It was hers, grown, washed, brushed, coiled, pulled back with her own hands that morning while her dad waited with the car outside. And now, it had been reduced to a texture to be questioned, a mistake to be corrected, a distraction to be smoothed away. She wondered what would happen if she shaved it off entirely. If she showed up bald, would that be more acceptable? More neutral? Or would they find something else? The cart came back around with water. This time, she wasn't skipped. But the attendant didn't ask her what she preferred, just dropped a cup with no ice in front of her like she was already known. Neria reached for it slowly. Her hand trembled slightly as her fingers wrapped around the plastic. Her throat was too dry to drink. She set it back down. The cabin lights dimmed further as evening fell. Shadows crept along the curves of the cabin walls. Most passengers leaned back in their reclining seats, scrolling through tablets, sipping wine, wrapping themselves in complimentary blankets, and settling into sleep. Neria sat upright. Her chair had the ability to recline, but she didn't trust the comfort. Comfort required the permission to relax. She had none. The tension in her spine held her still. Her neck ached. Her shoulder blades throbbed. But she sat like a statue, guarding a secret no one wanted to hear. Someone passed her row again. Another flight attendant. She made eye contact briefly and then looked away fast, as if Neria's face reminded her of something inconvenient. The cart stopped again, 3 rows up. She heard laughter. Then someone saying, "My grandmother used to hire girls like that to clean the guest wing. They always tried to act like they lived there." The word act hit hard. Neria had not said a word in 2 hours, but still they insisted she was performing. Neria felt every inch of it pressing down on her skin like a second layer she could never peel off. The magazine still sat untouched on the armrest, its glossy pages whispering lies she never asked to read. Her spine ached. Her lips were dry. Her hands trembled faintly in her lap, but she willed them still. She had endured the stares, the comments, the questions about her hair, her presence, her worth. She had endured being excluded from meals, ignored by attendants, turned into a prop for someone's live stream, and reduced to a social experiment. She had become silence embodied. But silence was heavy, and something inside her was starting to crack. Her book slipped from her lap and fell to the floor with a soft thump. It wasn't loud, not even disruptive, but it startled her. She leaned forward to pick it up, slow and careful, her knees angling sideways so she wouldn't bump the tray table. Her fingers reached for the spine, just as Lorelei turned toward her with a sudden, sharp breath. Without missing a beat, Lorelei shot her hand into the aisle and flagged down a passing flight attendant, her voice pitched loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Excuse me," she said, feigning calm but laced with accusation. "I feel extremely uncomfortable right now. This girl just reached toward my personal bag. I saw her hand go too far under the seat." Neria froze, halfway bent over. Her fingers tightened around the book. She straightened slowly, her eyes wide, confused, as the attendant approached. "Miss," the woman said cautiously, "can you sit back, please?" Neria obeyed without a word. "I dropped my book," she said quietly. Lorelei shook her head. "That's not all you dropped." The attendant frowned and turned toward Lorelei. "Did she touch your bag?" Lorelei placed a hand dramatically over her Louis Vuitton purse. "I don't know. I couldn't see everything, but I know what I felt. Her arm was under the seat. That's all I'm saying." A man 2 rows up turned around. A woman across the aisle narrowed her eyes. The energy in the cabin shifted again, no longer curiosity, but subtle suspicion. The attendant looked at Neria, who now sat stiffly, book in her lap like a guilty object. "I'm going to need to check your personal item, miss," the attendant said softly. Neria blinked. "What?" The attendant repeated, "Your bag. Just a quick inspection. A passenger has expressed concern." Neria turned to Lorelei, eyes searching for any sign of remorse, but Lorelei simply folded her arms and looked out the window. "I didn't accuse," she said to no one in particular. "I just voiced a feeling. We're allowed to feel unsafe, aren't we?" The flight attendant extended her hand again. "Please, miss." Neria's throat tightened. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, slowly unzipping her small backpack, revealing nothing but a phone charger, a spiral notebook, a wrapped protein bar, and a sketch pad she hadn't opened since boarding. The attendant rifled through it anyway, hands delicate but firm. She glanced up at Neria and offered a strained smile. "Thank you," she said, then turned and walked away. Lorelei exhaled softly, victorious. Nerea stared at her open bag for several long seconds before slowly zipping it closed again. No one said anything. No one asked if she was okay. No one apologized. Not the flight attendant. Not Lorelei. Not a single passenger who had heard everything. The woman across the aisle, who had once chuckled at a joke, now turned away in silence. The man 2 rows up whispered to his companion. She looked nervous the whole time. The words landed like punches Nerea couldn't block. Her body had become an exhibit again, on display for quiet judgment and public evaluation. Her innocence had been offered up for review. Her breath was shaky now. Her chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm. The tears had gathered before she even realized they were coming. She blinked them away, fast, but they pooled again. She turned sharply toward the window, hiding her face in the curve of her arm as the first tear slipped down. She told herself it was just one, but it wasn't. Another followed. Then another. She gritted her teeth, swallowing the sob that tried to rise in her throat. She bit down on her bottom lip so hard it trembled. Her shoulders trembled too. She didn't make a sound, but her body betrayed her. The shaking spread like a fault line finally giving way. Her arms folded across her stomach. Her head dropped slightly. She cried silently, so silently, but the pain was deafening inside her. Her whole world collapsed inward. The seat that had once felt too big now felt like a cage. Her breath came faster, and no amount of blinking could stop the tears. She wiped them with her sleeve again and again, but they kept coming, stubborn and warm and full of everything she hadn't said. Nerea kept her head pressed against the cool window, eyes closed, tears drying in slow trails down her cheeks. The ache in her chest had dulled, replaced by the hollow hum of exhaustion. She no longer cared about the cookie, the book, or even the way Lorelei now sat comfortably beside her, as if nothing had happened. The silence that followed her breakdown wasn't compassionate, it was strategic. The cabin had collectively agreed to look the other way, to let the moment pass, without accountability. But that silence was about to shatter. From the rear of the first-class cabin, a deep, composed voice broke the stale quiet. "Excuse me," it said, not loud, but commanding, with a tone that didn't ask for permission. Nerea's eyes opened slowly. She knew that voice. She turned her head just enough to see him step into the aisle. Malik Ray was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in plain, dark civilian clothes. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with quiet calculation. He moved with purpose, each step slow but sure, until he reached her row. He didn't speak to her directly. Instead, he turned toward the nearest flight attendant, Carly, who had just emerged from the galley with a tray of hot towels, and said calmly, "This row has been targeted since boarding. The moment my daughter sat down, she was subjected to a string of humiliations, false accusations, and discriminatory behavior. I have remained silent. I have watched. I have listened. But it stops now." Carly blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, Malik didn't let her finish." He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a slim black leather badge wallet. He flipped it open with practiced precision. The gold shield gleamed under the cabin lights. "Deputy Director Malik Ray, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Counterterrorism Division." A few gasps rippled through the cabin. Someone dropped their glass. A passenger's phone slipped from his hand and thudded softly onto the carpet. Malik let the badge speak for itself for a moment before he added, his voice colder now, "If anyone in this cabin touches or speaks to my daughter again in a way that compromises her dignity, there will be federal agents waiting at the gate. And they will not be serving drinks." He turned to Carly, who now looked pale, frozen in place. "You knew," he said. "You heard what was said. You let it happen. You fed it." Carly stammered, "Sir, I didn't." Malik raised his hand, cutting her off again. "I'm not here to debate. I'm here to document, which I've already done." With that, he held up a small device, the size of a thumb drive, clipped discreetly to the collar of Nerea's sweatshirt. "This is a live audio recorder, linked directly to a secure channel. every word spoken around my daughter since boarding has been recorded, time-stamped, and stored. He looked at Lorelei now. She didn't smirk this time. Her posture had stiffened, and her hand had drifted protectively toward her purse. We have, Malik continued, explicit evidence of racial profiling, character defamation, coercion, and obstruction of basic passenger rights. And not just from fellow passengers. He paused, sweeping the room with his gaze. From airline personnel, a murmur spread down the aisle. Someone began recording. A man in business class leaned over the divider to see what was happening. Carly tried to regain control. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to return to your seat." Malik turned to her, slowly. "You'll do nothing," he said. "Not until this flight is flagged and every second of this incident is documented and reported. You don't get to smile, hand out lavender towels, and pretend this never happened. Not this time." The pilot's voice cracked over the speaker, cautious and uncertain. This is your captain. We've been made aware of a disturbance in first class. We're coordinating with ground response at arrival. Please remain calm." But the calm had already fractured. Lorelei tried to speak now, her voice feigning poise. "Mr. Ray, I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding. No one meant to offend." Malik cut her off, not with anger, but finality. "You accused a child of theft. You suggested her appearance was inappropriate. You handed her a magazine and told her to erase who she is. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. A pattern you thought would go unnoticed. But I noticed. And now, so will everyone else." He stepped forward and picked up the fashion magazine Lorelei had left on the armrest. He held it up for a moment, then dropped it onto the floor between their seats with a dismissive flick. "This," he said, "is your idea of inspiration. Mine is sitting right here, holding herself together while the world tried to tear her down." Neria, eyes wide and wet, looked at her father, not in surprise, but in quiet relief. For the first time since boarding, she didn't feel alone. She didn't feel small. She didn't feel invisible. Her father placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, but a sob caught in her throat. She swallowed it. Malik didn't push. He stood straight, scanned the cabin again, and spoke one final time. "The only reason this has gone unchallenged is because you counted on her silence. You thought it meant weakness. But silence doesn't mean surrender. It means someone's watching." Her father's hand still rested lightly on her shoulder, grounding her as the world finally started to shift. Around them, passengers had gone from passive observers to uneasy witnesses. The veil of polite cruelty had been ripped clean off, and now every smirk, every muttered joke, every calculated slight hung in the air like smoke waiting to choke its source. Somewhere up front, the curtain to the cockpit twitched. A moment later, the captain's voice returned, more measured now, more alert. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing a slight delay due to communication from ground control. We ask that all passengers remain seated with seatbelts fastened. We'll provide an update shortly." But the delay wasn't slight. Malik's badge had triggered a cascade, and the ripples had already begun to hit the shore. Less than a minute later, a soft chime sounded overhead, and a different attendant, a senior one Neria hadn't seen before, approached with a satellite phone in hand. Her voice was low, but her words carried weight. "Mr. Ray," she said, eyes fixed only on him, "the airline central operations office is requesting to speak with you directly. They said it's urgent." Malik accepted the phone without hesitation. "This is Ray," he said, his tone calm, controlled. He listened for a few seconds, then his brows tightened. "Yes, I'm prepared to cooperate. I have recordings, real-time logs, and visual support from cabin surveillance. But this doesn't stay in-house. Not anymore." He paused again, then said, "I'll expect your internal response team to meet us at the arrival gate, along with federal liaison officers. If not, I'll forward everything directly to the Civil Rights Division and go public." He handed the phone back without waiting for confirmation. In the cabin, no one moved. Lorelei sat rigid, her jaw clenched, the once comfortable blanket now clutched like armor across her lap. The man who had live-streamed earlier had slowly lowered his phone, unsure whether to delete the footage or keep it for leverage. The couple who had made the air quality remark no longer made eye contact with anyone. Everything felt off balance now, the cabin tilting not physically but morally, and no one could pretend otherwise. Malik stepped away from Neria's row, gave her a reassuring glance, and walked up the aisle to address the cabin directly. "I know many of you may be uncomfortable right now," he said, voice unwavering. "But I want to remind you that discomfort is not the same as injustice. What my daughter endured was systemic, coordinated, and condoned until it was witnessed by someone with authority." He let that land. She didn't cry out. She didn't retaliate. She did nothing to provoke this. And yet many of you either participated or remained silent. That silence speaks volumes. His eyes swept across every row. But now the silence is over. The intercom crackled again. The captain's voice was tighter now. "Due to active law enforcement involvement, this aircraft will remain grounded until further notice. Please remain in your seats. Do not tamper with overhead compartments or attempt to deplane unless instructed." A few passengers gasped. A woman began whispering frantically to her husband. The mood had shifted from passive compliance to subtle panic. 2 rows back, a young man pulled out his phone and began uploading a video. Quiet footage of Neria sitting still, head bowed, and Malik standing tall beside her. Within moments, others followed suit. The footage, audio included, began hitting social platforms. Someone tweeted, "This girl was harassed in first class. Her dad's FBI. And now the plane's not even allowed to take off. Watch this." The clip was barely 40 seconds long. It didn't need to be longer. Within 15 minutes, it had already been shared over 12,000 times. A passenger from the economy section approached the divider, ignoring the rules. "Excuse me," he said softly to Malik. "I saw some of what happened. If statements are being taken, I'd like to give one." Malik nodded. "They will be. Thank you." The dam had broken. Others began to murmur, some with guilt, others with hesitation. But the current was shifting. And in the middle of it all sat Neria, still quiet, still folded into herself, but no longer unseen. Then came the announcement that no one expected. A soft ding. The screen embedded in the back of each seat flickered from the usual in-flight menu to a black background. Then white text appeared. "In compliance with Federal Investigation Protocol, this aircraft's cabin cameras and microphones are now under official review." The words disappeared, replaced by a muted playback. It wasn't long, just a 1-minute excerpt. But it was enough. Lorelai's voice came through crystal clear. "She doesn't exactly match the passenger profile. Might be a scholarship fluke." Then Carly's, "We'll keep an eye on her." Then the corporate group. "Guess the origin story, public school, probably inner city." And finally Lorelai again, "You could be polished if you just learned to tone down the wildness." Then came the sound of a name being called over the intercom. "Passenger Lorelai Stanford, please prepare to disembark. You are no longer permitted on this flight." A beat of silence passed. Then a uniformed crew member appeared at her row with a clipboard. "Ma'am, you'll need to collect your belongings now." Lorelai's hands trembled. "You can't be serious." The woman replied, voice neutral but firm. "The airline has placed you on its indefinite no-fly list. Federal instruction confirmed." Lorelai stood slowly, lips pressed tight, eyes darting from passenger to passenger. No one offered sympathy. No one spoke. She was invisible now, not the kind Neria had been, but the kind people choose to forget. As Lorelai walked down the aisle, the same cameras that had once been pointed discreetly now followed her exit. Neria didn't look up. She didn't have to. Her father sat beside her again, quiet but steady. "It's starting," he whispered. "Justice doesn't knock. It enters." By the time the plane landed, the story had already outrun it. News vans waited behind the gates. Reporters clustered near the terminal. Security flanked the arrival doors like walls of consequence. Neria stepped off the plane in silence, walking slightly behind her father, her backpack zipped tight against her shoulders. Her head held a little higher than it had been hours ago. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. The world had already decided to look at her. And this time, it wasn't through a lens of mockery. It was through awe and guilt and reckoning. Footage of the flight had gone viral. Not just one video, dozens. Different angles, different voices, different pieces of a puzzle that came together to form a damning portrait. Teen girl harassed in first class. The headlines read, "Passenger removed after public exposure of racial profiling." Hashtags trended for hours. Hashtag Neria speaks. Hashtag silence is not safety. Hashtag first class doesn't mean white class. Comment sections filled with outrage. Politicians tweeted support. Celebrities reposted the clip with one word: unacceptable. Lorelei Stanford's name made the rounds quickly. Within 48 hours, the board of the Mid-Atlantic Contemporary Arts Institute, where she had served as executive director for 12 years, announced her immediate termination. In a brief statement, they cited gross violation of ethical standards and behavior inconsistent with a mission of cultural inclusion. By the end of the week, 3 corporate sponsors pulled their funding from the institute. Lorelei's public apology, issued through a lawyer, fell flat. The world had seen the video. They had heard her voice, dripping with entitlement, suggesting a child should tone down the wildness. There was no editing that away. Her reputation didn't erode, it collapsed. The airline, under intense public scrutiny, launched a formal investigation. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Malik Ray had filed a report so detailed, so irrefutable, that internal counsel had no choice but to act. The crew of Flight 378 was placed on immediate administrative leave. Multiple attendants, including Carly, were suspended pending disciplinary review. The airline's public relations team scrambled, but their initial response, generic and non-committal, only made things worse. They retracted it within hours and issued a new one, bolder, apologetic, and laced with terms like systemic failure, unconscious bias, and corrective action. Still, public trust wavered. It wasn't enough to punish. The public wanted transformation. So the airline reached out to Malik Ray directly, not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. They didn't offer money. They offered something else, a platform. They asked if Neria would be willing to serve as the face of their new initiative, Elevate Every Voice, a campaign centered on restoring dignity in elite spaces, focused on empowering young travelers of color in academic and professional fields. They expected a polite refusal. They expected the Ray family to retreat into privacy. But Neria surprised them. A week later, she stood on a stage not far from the airport where everything had gone wrong, wearing a navy blue blazer over her NASA sweatshirt. The crowd was quiet, cameras pointed, microphones live. She stepped up to the podium, looked at the sea of faces, and didn't flinch. She cleared her throat and said, "I didn't ask to become a symbol. I didn't plan to go viral. I just wanted to get on a plane, read my book, and fly with my dad. But that seat, 2A, came with a cost. I paid it quietly. I paid it with silence, with stillness, with tears that I didn't want anyone to see. And now everyone has seen them." She paused, her voice unwavering. "I used to think I had to change something about myself to fit into rooms like that. My hair, my voice, my presence. But I don't. I'm not the one who needs to change." The crowd erupted in applause. She waited for it to fade. What happened to me is not new. What's new is that someone listened, and someone recorded, and someone didn't stay silent. That's why I'm standing here. Not because I'm strong, but because I was believed. The campaign rolled out in phases. Ads featuring young Black, Latino, and Asian students traveling for STEM conferences, college interviews, internships. Taglines like "Excellence has no ethnicity," and "Representation is not disruption." Billboards, commercials, airport terminals began displaying new messaging. And in the center of it all, Neria's photo, arms folded, eyes clear, standing inside the same plane where she had once folded in on herself. Malik returned to work, but his phone didn't stop ringing. Invitations for interviews, panels, workshops on how to build systems of accountability in corporate spaces. but he turned most of them down. "This isn't about me," he said in every reply. "Let my daughter speak." And she did. Neria's classmates at school started treating her differently, not with pity, but with pride. Her science teacher printed out a screenshot of her speech and pinned it to the classroom wall with a note. "Let her remind you, dignity isn't given, it's claimed." Her principal invited her to lead the school's first equity council. She declined, not because she wasn't ready, but because she had other things to focus on. She had work to do. She had questions to ask. The stars hadn't gone anywhere, and she was still chasing them. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. What part of this story hit you the hardest? Was it the silence? The justice? The turning point? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from right now? Let's build a global conversation that stands for dignity, voice, and truth.